the country that disappeared from the map. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the country your ancestors called home for generations is no longer shown as an independent nation on the world's maps. The flag is gone. The government is gone. The borders have changed, and the leader who once represented your people is thousands of miles away, living in exile. This sounds like the beginning of a political thriller, but it happened in real life. This is the story of Tibet, a mysterious land high above Asia, surrounded by some of the world's greatest mountains, where religion, politics, and identity became so deeply connected that separating them became almost impossible. But how did Tibet go from functioning as a largely self-governing state in the first half of the 20th century to becoming part of the People's Republic of China? And why does the question of Tibet remain so controversial more than 70 years later? To understand what happened, we have to go back to a time when the map of Asia looked very different. The roof of the world, Tibet, sits on an enormous plateau surrounded by the Himalayas. For centuries, its geography helped protect it from outside powers. But isolation did not mean weakness. Tibet developed its own civilization, language, traditions, religious institutions, and political structures. At the center of Tibetan society was Tibetan Buddhism. Monasteries were not simply places where monks prayed. They were centers of education, philosophy, art, medicine, and political influence. And at the heart of the political and spiritual system stood the Dalai Lama. For generations, the Dalai Lama represented both religious authority and, for much of modern Tibetan history, political leadership. But Tibet's relationship with China was complicated. Different Chinese empires exercised varying degrees of influence over Tibet at different times, and historians still debate exactly how those relationships should be understood. Then, in 1911, the Qing dynasty collapsed. China entered a period of revolution, civil conflict, and political instability, and Tibet took advantage of the situation. By the early 1910s, Chinese troops and officials had been expelled from Lhasa, and the Tibetan government exercised effective control over much of the territory it governed. For several decades, Tibet operated with its own government, currency, military, and foreign relations. Supporters of Tibetan independence described this period as de facto independence. The Chinese government tells a very different story, arguing that Tibet remained part of China. And this disagreement over history would eventually become one of the most important political conflicts in modern Asia. But then, China changed forever. The Revolution. In 1949, Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party established the People's Republic of China. The new government began consolidating control over territories it considered part of China. And Tibet was impossible to ignore. It was strategically located on the roof of Asia, bordering India, and sitting beside some of the most important geographical routes on the continent. In 1950, the People's Liberation Army entered eastern Tibet. Tibetan forces were defeated at Chamdo. Suddenly, the Tibetan government faced a terrifying reality. It was facing a vastly larger military power. Tibet could resist or negotiate. In 1951, Tibetan representatives signed the 17-point agreement with the Chinese government. Beijing described it as the peaceful liberation of Tibet. But the Tibetan government later rejected the agreement, arguing that its representatives had signed under military pressure. The agreement recognized Chinese sovereignty, while promising autonomy and protection for Tibetan religion and traditional institutions. For a short time, there was still hope that Tibet's distinctive political and cultural system might survive. But underneath the agreement, tension was growing, and eventually, that tension exploded. The uprising. During the 1950s, resistance to Chinese rule grew in several Tibetan regions. Political reforms, land reforms, military presence, and attempts to transform traditional society created deep resentment. Armed resistance developed. Refugees began moving toward central Tibet, and the situation became increasingly unstable. Then came March 1959. A Chinese military invitation to the Dalai Lama triggered rumors that he might be detained. Thousands of Tibetans gathered around the Norbalinka Palace in Lhasa. They wanted to prevent their leader from being taken away. The atmosphere became extremely tense, and then the Dalai Lama made the decision that would change Tibetan history forever. The escape. On the night of March 17th, 1959, the Dalai Lama left Lhasa. He disguised himself as an ordinary soldier. With a small group of companions, he slipped away from the palace and began a dangerous journey toward India. Behind him was a city on the edge of violent confrontation. Ahead were mountains, military checkpoints, and an uncertain future. For nearly 2 weeks, the group traveled through difficult terrain. Then, on March 31st, 1959, the Dalai Lama crossed into India. He was 24 years old. Historians continue to debate the complicated relationship between Tibet and successive Chinese governments and empires. But beyond the political arguments is something much more human. Imagine being born into a family whose grandparents fled their homeland. Imagine hearing stories about a place you have never seen. Imagine learning a language your ancestors spoke for centuries, while living thousands of miles from the land where that language developed. That is the reality of exile for many Tibetans. And now another question is approaching. The Dalai Lama is aging. One day there will be a new Dalai Lama, and when that happens, who will recognize him? The Tibetan religious community, the Chinese government, both, or neither? The answer could determine the future of one of the world's most recognizable spiritual traditions, the country that refused to disappear. Tibet's story is ultimately bigger than politics. It is about what happens when borders change, but people's memories do not. Governments can redraw maps, armies can take territory, political systems can collapse. But identity is much harder to erase. A Tibetan family preserving its language, a monk continuing an ancient tradition, a child learning the stories of a homeland they have never visited. These things keep a civilization alive. So perhaps the most haunting question isn't, where is Tibet on the map? The real question is, what makes a country a country? Is it borders, a government, international recognition, or can a homeland continue to exist in the hearts and memories of its people, even after its political identity has been transformed? Tibet remains part of China today, but the debate surrounding its history, culture, autonomy, and identity has never truly disappeared. And perhaps that is the most remarkable part of this story. Tibet may have disappeared as an independent country from the modern political map, but it never disappeared from history. It never disappeared from the memories of its people. And it never disappeared from the world's imagination. Because sometimes a country can lose its place on a map without ever losing its place in the hearts of those who call it home. And Tibet's story is far from over. Especially during the Cultural Revolution, religious institutions across Tibet suffered severe destruction. Monasteries were damaged or demolished. Religious practices were restricted. Ancient cultural objects and manuscripts were lost. Traditional institutions were attacked. For Tibetans, the conflict was no longer simply about who controlled the government. It was about whether their language, religion, traditions, and identity could survive. But something unexpected happened. The culture survived. It survived in families, in prayers, in language, in stories, in communities scattered across India, Nepal, Bhutan, and other parts of the world. And most importantly, it survived in memory. Meanwhile, the Dalai Lama became one of the world's most recognizable religious leaders. From exile, he spoke about Tibetan culture, religious freedom, peace, and non-violence. In 1989, he received the Nobel Peace Prize. But Beijing viewed him very differently, regarding him as a separatist figure. The Dalai Lama later promoted the middle way approach, calling for meaningful autonomy for Tibetans within the People's Republic of China, rather than demanding complete independence. And this reveals something important about the Tibetan question. It isn't simply a fight over land, it is a fight over identity. Because if you ask whether Tibet disappeared, the answer is complicated. Did Tibet disappear? Tibet did not literally vanish. The mountains are still there. The cities are still there. The monasteries are still there. And millions of Tibetans still live on the Tibetan plateau. But the political situation changed completely. Today, the Tibet Autonomous Region is part of the People's Republic of China, while other historically Tibetan areas are located in neighboring Chinese provinces. Tibet no longer exists as an independent state. And that is why the phrase, "the country that disappeared from the map," is so powerful. Because what disappeared was not the land. It was the political independence claimed by Tibetans before Chinese control was established in the early 1950s. And the debate over how to describe that transformation remains intensely contested. The question that never died today. Beijing argues that Tibet has always been an inseparable part of China. Tibetan exile authorities and supporters of Tibetan independence argue that Tibet was effectively independent before the Chinese communist takeover. He had escaped Tibet, but he would never return. The uprising in Lhasa was crushed. The Tibetan government in Lhasa effectively collapsed, and thousands of Tibetans fled across the Himalayas. The political center of Tibetan life had now moved outside Tibet itself. And that was only the beginning. When culture became the battlefield, the following decades brought enormous upheaval.